public supports it, overwhelmingly Aboriginal groups support it, the cabinet has reviewed it twice and approved it, and now the courts have spoken yet again.
Jason Kenney talking there about the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion after the Federal Court of Appeal found there was meaningful consultation with First Nations.
To anybody who says that you can't get major projects built in this country, you can't.
Now, Ottawa has to deal with another proposal. Teck Resources' $20 billion frontier mine would be one of Alberta's largest ever.
The Liberals are holding hostage 10,000 much-needed jobs in Alberta. No wonder Alberta says this decision is a national unity issue.
We are mandated to review the environmental impacts of all of those projects. We will be making a decision by the end of February.
That decision will be undoubtedly another test for the Trudeau Liberals on one of the most divisive debates in this country. How does the government balance the environment and the economy? At Issue is here to tackle that. Chantal Hébert is in Montreal. Andrew Coyne is in St. John's tonight. And Althea Raj is here in Ottawa. Good to see everyone. So let's start with the TMX decision this week, which was an important one, certainly, for the government. I suppose it could now be appealed to the Supreme Court, but the judgment itself made some pretty definitive statements around the way this consultation went. Chantal, I'll start with you. From your take, is that part of the debate over?
Yes, there has been, since the new year, a feeling of inevitability that this project will be built to completion, in part because of this week's ruling that can be appealed, yes, but it is a unanimous ruling. And that will have some way if it is taken to the Supreme Court, but also the Supreme Court's rebuttal to BC's attempt to have it affirm its right to decide how much fossil fuel and others can transit through its territory. So that's 2-0 for the project. It is really hard to see where in the court system or politically this battle could be taken to another level and won by opponents of the project.
And it's a good thing probably too, because the shovels are actually in the ground. Construction has started, so to have to put the brakes on that would have been problematic for the government, certainly. Andrew, your thoughts on whether this particular issue now is sort of over?
Well, with regard to Trans Mountain Pipeline, perhaps. I think there's still waits to be seen what kind of extra legal or sort of guerrilla action type of opposition we might see, but perhaps that's also going to subside in the face of the seeming inevitability of it. But I think what this tells us is, for this issue in general, we talk about it as being the environment versus the economy, but it's actually like about a 5- or 6-sided equation. It's not just the environment and the economy, it's also Indigenous groups for and against, provincial governments for and against. And navigating through all this, I think, is partly what's been so bedeviling for everybody involved. I will say, however, the last week or two has been a pretty good week or two for pipeline development. You had not only these two court decisions favorable to it, but you actually had the government of Alberta and the government of Canada saying nice things about each other. That's unusual.
It may not continue either. I guess we'll see by the end of the month. But Althea, your take on TMX and whether the chapter is closed there, in spite of the fact that there are a handful of First Nations groups that are still very upset.
Well, I don't think it is, just for that very reason. Whether or not this case goes to the Supreme Court, I'm sure the Indigenous groups would like to see it, but it looked like the way the Court of Appeal structured its decision, it went kind of beyond the scope of what it was required to do in dismissing all of the 4 claims one by one on every point, I assume in a way to prevent or to kind of make it moot going to the Supreme Court. But there are many things in the judgment that I think will probably irk Indigenous groups and Indigenous people throughout this country. It almost, the first 20 pages of the judgment almost seem like it would engineer an emotional response. Like, it talks about reconciliation by saying that the process of consultation based on a relationship of mutual respect advances reconciliation regardless of the outcome. The court doesn't feel that it needs to define what is reasonable and meaningful, because that would be too strict a standard, and it would give Indigenous groups a potential veto. It says, you know, come to our table, but we will decide what we think competing societal interests are, and we are not forced to listen to you. And I think that, and that message that they have heard, that message that they've heard repeatedly, I think that is a barrier to reconciliation. So I think that issue is not dead.
But I'm not sure it's that clear-cut in the sense that what the court actually said is the duty to consult does not require the outcome to be unanimity amongst the indigenous groups. And at this point...
But that's not what they said.
Yes, they did point out that there were a number, more than 100, in their writing.
That's true.
That had either stopped opposing or agreed with the Trans Mountain expansion, leaving the 4 who were still in court asking for review. I think a lot of provincial governments will take some relief from the notion that unanimity in any community is hard to achieve. BC has to deal with that problem at this very juncture. The other step to that, I don't believe, is litigation or even guerrilla war, but the debate that will surround the federal government's promise to implement the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous People. And the conservative contention, for instance, that literally means handing a veto to Indigenous groups on future developments. I'm not sure that's right, but I think that battle is going to continue in the House of Commons.
Well, and that legislation will come, we're told. And it's interesting because you point out what's happening in BC right now, and they have, in fact, legislated on the UN Declaration of Indigenous Peoples. So it's almost a test in some way, I guess, for how the federal government moves forward. Let's turn to the decision they have to make by the end of the month. This big Teck Frontier oil sands mine. It's a huge project. The CEO has said that, you know, unless the price of oil goes up, I'm not even sure it makes sense, that it's profitable. The company itself has now committed to some environmental standards around net zero by 2050, which is now the government's goal. Andrew, if you had to read the tea leaves on this, the fact that TMX seems to be moving forward, I don't know, does that give the government an out here, or is Alberta not going to let them off the hook that quickly?
The sense I get is that the government would like to find a deal where the project goes ahead, but there's some compensating, offsetting initiative that they can claim victory on that, of moving towards net zero, et cetera, which I think is perfectly valid. I think we have to get out of this idea of weighing every single project as if it's the only project and the only thing that has to be weighed in the balance about whether or not we're meeting our targets. What matters is the totality. What matters is you know, what's the overall progress towards it, and you can, even if you're allowing more emissions in one area, you can reduce emissions in another, and that's the way in which we should be looking at these questions.
Althea, you were writing today, I think, or yesterday, about some questions inside caucus around the project, and I guess whether the Liberals felt approving the project would in some way hurt their environmental bona fides.
So there's definitely some members of cabinet, and I think the Prime Minister actually is of this mind. I don't know that to be the case, but that seems to be the general sense that a middle ground is possible here, that they could approve the project with conditions, that they would, kind of like Amarjeet. So he mentioned or publicly floated the idea of having fixed caps and targets. Whether that's enforceable is another issue. That would help Canada get to its promise to be net zero by 2050. The caucus is not behind the Prime Minister on this issue. The overwhelming majority of caucus is not, and I would even go so far to say as most members of cabinet are not. And it's going to be very tricky because this is a minority government. A lot of caucus members feel, and frankly, when you look at where the Liberals have members, they're mostly in Ontario and Quebec. Those people went to the polls and basically told NDP swing voters, vote for us, and they were met, yeah, but you bought a pipeline. How can I trust you on these environmental pledges? And they fear that that is once again, not only that they don't agree with the policy, they think 4.1 million tons of carbon emissions is way too much and it will prevent us from meeting our Paris climate targets, but they feel like the politics don't make any sense, that the voters in Alberta are never going to vote Liberal, even if they put their neck out for a project that may not even get built, why would the government do this? And so this is a very hot and contentious issue within the Liberal caucus.
There are people around the cabinet table who are making the case that that so-called middle ground is the perfect place to stand if you want to get shot at and killed by both sides. I.e. those
they
conditions.
Like the middle ground, though. They like it.
Yes, and many of their members, Althea is totally right, and that includes ministers, say, look at what that did to us. It was hard to go door to door and tell voters who are concerned about climate change that the government had bought a pipeline, that the first major decision of this government on a file related to climate change is to double down on more oil sands development is actually in a different league than expanding a pipeline to take care or take whatever is produced to tidewater. Yeah. So this issue divides caucus and the Prime Minister and Cabinet far more than the Trans Mountain expansion ever did. And there are Liberals who will tell you, if you think Trans Mountain was an albatross for us, this is 5 times the albatross.
So what about the gamble, Andrew, of just doing what we've all heard, that we'll give you the green light with these conditions and just hope that it doesn't get built, or does that just do you lose all your credibility anyway, whether it happens or not?
Well, it depends which groups of voters you're talking about. There are obviously there are voters who are climate change absolutists. And yes, if you're in a riding where the contest is between a Liberal and an NDP, you're going to feel a particular way about that. There are also voters who want to see a balance being struck, and not just in Alberta, but also in Ontario. And if you're a riding where you're contesting with a Conservative MP, you might be more inclined to say, we've got to make sure we strike the right balance here. So I think there's risks in both directions for the government in this regard.
I think the problem, though, can I just add that I think the government made the case for the pipeline, and I think other premiers, not just Premier Notley at the time, but made the case that the pipeline was necessary. Aside from saying this is a national unity issue, you're basically telling Alberta, giving them the finger, we don't need you. Like, nobody is saying why this project that will possibly provide $70 billion in tax revenue, and when it's up and running, 2,500 jobs, nobody has come out and made a clear case as to why this is in the national interest. So it is hard, I think, for the Liberals to say yes to this project Chantal, in a way that it wasn't for TMX.
It's definitively a lose-lose decision, whichever side of the issue you want to look at it from. But the underlying question, once that call is made, is if you say yes to this, and it will contribute significantly to climate change emissions, what project exactly would you say no to in the name of your climate change targets?
Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, and Althea Raj back for an extended round of that issue. Let's talk about the Conservative leadership race. We may talk about this every week until June. But specifically today, one of the perceived frontrunners, if not the frontrunner, Peter MacKay. Over the weekend, MacKay's campaign tweeted out a video of the Liberal leader performing yoga moves, saying his Liberal campaign had yoga and spa expenses, and the video says Liberals can't be trusted. Now MacKay says that he wants a more civilized tone in the campaign, so that tweet drew some online backlash. His handlers also cut short an interview this week with CTV when he was asked about it. Also this week, MacKay had to walk back some comments he made about the Conservative Party's policy on moving Canada's embassy in Israel. And I would say that there was more than one column this week about why Peter MacKay can't get out of his own way. And I mean, that's sort of what everyone was thinking. Like, if you seem to be the front runner, go ahead and run the campaign. Why are you shooting yourself in the foot so early on? And what does that tell us, if anything? You want to start, Chantal?
Okay, I'll be generous. Rusty. Is sometimes what happens, and to date myself, it reminds me of John Turner's run for the leadership against Jean Chrétien, which didn't live up to the advanced billing. And the other word, and I'm being kind again, is if you're the front runner, you get to have to put up with a lot more scrutiny right from the start, and that means you never get the chance to hit your stride before everyone's onto you.
I think that's very generous because I'm not sure. Like I mean, he basically said about that tweet when he talked to our Hannah Thibodeau, oh, I saw that and that shouldn't have happened. And I don't know. Obviously, you're not looking at every tweet that happens, but you've certainly given a direction to your campaign about what kind of messaging you want to put out there. And it all seemed very strange to me, Andrew. And I don't know whether that it's going to matter or whether it's a sign that this is not going as smoothly or will not be as smooth as Peter MacKay might like.
Well, it's a good reason to have a competitive race, first of all, is so that people actually do get tested and you don't get saddled with somebody who's not ready for prime time just because it was all predetermined in advance. Sure. To add to Chantal's point about front runners, it's not just the increased scrutiny, it's also that as the front runner, you tend to play it really safe, you're not taking any risks. And when you're not doing that, when you don't have anything to say because you're just trying to say as little as possible and just tiptoe to the leadership, then every mistake you make gets magnified and you start doubting yourself and second-guessing yourself. We should add to that, if I can be frank, he does not have a reputation as being the sharpest knife in the drawer. So you add that he doesn't really have a message. There's not really a theme. There's not really a point. There's not really an argument he's making to the leadership other than I'm Peter MacKay and I deserve it, or it's my time, or whatever the message is. Then the gap is going to be filled with all kinds of gaffes and stink bombs.
Well, I mean, it seems like the only message I've seen so far might be I'm Peter MacKay and I can take on Justin Trudeau, and you know, maybe that works for the membership, but I'm not sure how that works when you get to a general. And I realize they're two different contests, but I'm not sure. Althea, how are you reading things?
It doesn't seem like he has a message. And frankly, at the moment, doesn't seem like he has any principles either. If you look back at that tweet in question and the $860 that the Liberal Party had paid for Justin Trudeau, or Justin Trudeau's campaign had paid for him, he went on TV and said, well, you know, I don't think that was right, but I'm not going to take the tweet down. I'm going to leave it up. Well, if you think it's inappropriate and you are opposed to that type of attack, then surely the proper thing to do is to take the tweet down. Mm-hmm. So if you're not taking the tweet down, then you're kind of saying that you do approve of that message.
Sure. And similarly, in that interview where his handler shut the interview down, he might have turned that into a positive if he said, look, and he sort of started saying, look, she's a journalist, she's doing her job. If he'd actually insisted on the point, rather than kind of meekly submitting to his handlers, it might have turned into a positive rather than a negative.
But I agree, if he had something to say, he would fill the vacuum with something, you know?
Well, exactly. I think the vacuum is more important than all those missteps. But that being said, I do realize I was the kind person on this one.
Yes, you were. Things just got worse and worse as we went through everybody. Hey. But I wonder, does it tell you something about him or about the team? I know some of the people around him certainly, and they're not new to politics. So I'm not sure if they've sat down and discussed the strategy, or if they're just sort of, taking for granted, as we've all said, that he has a certain advance, or that he's a little further ahead in the race.
He's running to be the leader. He is the leader of the team that he has at the moment. Therefore, the team's gaffes are his gaffes.
Right.
Yeah, he owns it.
And the people you're going to attract are the people who want the safe option, the people who are there because this is your meal ticket. You're not going to get the people who have a really strong sense of who you are as a candidate and why you're in the race. They're there because they think you can win.
Well, that's not. But that may not necessarily be the case in all leadership races.
But the challenge, of course, is those who are holding out to see what happens need to have another horse to ride. And at this point, they may or they may not. Yes. This is a young campaign.
Well, I mean, there's talk today, and our friend John Iveson has written about it. The rumors of John Baird being talked about, and I mean, listen, we've talked about every possible option so far for this race, and most people are not jumping in. So I don't know if it's another one of these, but the fact that there is still just weeks out from the first deadline, this desire to find someone else is still sort of curious to me as well.
There's a very strong desire.
Andrew, yeah.
My sense is there's a very strong desire in the party for other options. People are not happy with the options they got so far.
Althea.
I was going to say, there just doesn't seem like there was a plan. For somebody who has wanted this job for so many years, that basically kind of put the first knives into Andrew Scheer back in the fall, you would have thought that there would be a policy plan, a communications plan, and if this is it, then it's pretty weak. And I would, if I was a leadership candidate, I'd be retooling too.
If all those dream candidates or nightmare candidates, call them what you want, Jean Charest, Rona Ambrose, and Pierre Poilievre had run, I don't think we'd be discussing front-runner Peter MacKay tonight.
Okay.
But there's, you know, this is why there's always room for political entrepreneurship. The sure thing that scares everybody off oftentimes turns out to be made of sand, and so people who do get in may pay off for them.
Okay. So we'll expect to hear from Peter MacKay after this. Thanks, everybody. We'll talk more about it. Appreciate it.